It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn, Vincent. The Trump administration has cracked down on immigration. The president has conducted more ICE raids, signaled tougher security at the border, and has prevented fewer legal immigrants from entering the country. He's also trying to end humanitarian immigration programs. One of those is temporary protected status, or TPS. The administration has revoked deportation protections from about 1 million people in the U.S. Most of them are from Venezuela and Honduras. It's trying to revoke TPS from other countries, but the courts have blocked that. The Department of Homeland Security says many countries on the TPS list are no longer in crisis. Our next guest says otherwise. Megan Hauptman is a litigation staff attorney for the International Refugee Assistance Project. She's fighting the Trump administration to keep TPS for over 6,000 people from Syria. Over 1,500 of them live in Michigan alone. So what exactly is TPS status, and what would happen if more people were to lose it? To discuss that, we have Megan here with us. Welcome to the Metro.
Thanks so much for having me, Robyn.
First off, what is temporary protected status?
Of course. So temporary protected status is a humanitarian program that was created by Congress in the 90s to provide a temporary status and protection to individuals in the United States who are nationals of countries in crisis, whether the country is going through an armed conflict, an environmental disaster, or other extraordinary conditions. TPS provides individuals with status, protection from deportation, detention, and also provides them with work authorization.
Okay, so we understand the basics now of how this helps people to essentially build a life, to begin a life in the U.S. Who exactly is eligible for TPS, and how do they become eligible?
Yes, so TPS is based on someone's nationality, not on someone's specific claim. So once the Department of Homeland Security has designated a particular country for TPS because of the general conditions, anyone who is already in the United States before a specified date, who doesn't have, certain disqualifying criminal convictions or other ineligibilities, is able to apply for temporary protected status based on their nationality alone and the amount of time they've been in the U.S.
All right, and I'm going to keep saying temporary protected status instead of TPS, just so that we can keep listeners understanding where we're going and what we're talking about here. I'm wondering how temporary protected status is different from getting asylum here in the U.S.
Of course. So as I mentioned, temporary protected status doesn't require people to put forth an individual claim that they will be persecuted or harmed in their country of origin. Asylum requires people to affirmatively apply and present a claim of fear based on their particular characteristics or experiences. In comparison, temporary protected status is available to all nationals of a designated country without having to make an individualized showing.
So from my understanding from the reporting I've done, getting asylum is difficult. There are a lot of hoops to jump through, and it sounds to me like temporary protected status is easier to get than asylum. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, that's correct. Asylum is both has tighter qualifying criteria and also takes a very long time to go through the process. In comparison, temporary protected status is widely available, and as long as someone meets the baseline eligibility, they're able to receive it.
Okay, so when we think about people in Syria who have fled chaos and have come to the U.S., it was an easier route. It was a path of lesser resistance to apply for that temporary protected status versus asylum. Syrian temporary protected status is awaiting a Supreme Court decision, and there are oral arguments that are going to happen in what, about 1 week. So I'm wondering, what is your argument that the U.S. should keep Syria on the temporary protected status list?
Yeah, of course. So back in September, Secretary Noem announced the termination of TPS for Syria. At the time, it was the 8th of what are now 13 terminations of TPS designations for countries all over the globe. This was part of an effort to end TPS for every country that's come up for her review. And this termination, which only gave people 2 months to plan, threatened to upend the lives of Syrians who have lived in the U.S. for more than a decade with strong family and community ties, and would force them to return to a country that remains in crisis, that remains dangerous, with almost no time to prepare. So we filed this lawsuit on behalf of 7 Syrian TPS holders and applicants to challenge unlawful actions in terminating TPS. And the case has made its way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court is considering both whether the termination of TPS for Syria was unlawful, but is also considering a larger question of whether courts can review these types of TPS decision-making actions at all. So it has big implications for TPS across the board.
As you mentioned, former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has had a lot of opposition to this, and she was speaking about why she terminated TPS status for Somalians in America. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Well, TPS is a program that was always meant to be temporary. It's a program that is put in place, and I believe for Somalia over 30 years ago, and will need to be evaluated to make sure that it comes and is always implemented in the process for which it was intended.
So I want to zoom in on that particular argument. The administration has said the TPS program has been overused. That temporary protective status continues to get renewed, but it's meant to be temporary. What do you make of that perspective?
Well, I think it's important to remember that temporary protected status was designed to provide humanitarian protection for people when it is unsafe for them to return to their home countries because of war, natural disaster, or crises. And Congress, when it passed the temporary protected status program, chose not to include any limits on how many times a country's designation could get extended, because what really matters is whether or not the country is safe to return to. There's nothing in the statute that limits the amount of time that TPS can be in place. All it requires is an analysis of whether it is safe to return to that country. If it is not yet safe to return, the statute requires that TPS must continue.
Yes, I mean, this is a lot of, this gets to the heart of the argument here, is what constitutes safety? What does that safety in another country actually look like? I mean, it has me thinking back to September. The Department of Homeland Security gave a statement on why they canceled temporary protected status designation for Syria. The DHS Assistant Secretary, Tricia McLaughlin, said, quote, "This is what restoring sanity to America's immigration system looks like. Conditions in Syria no longer prevent their nationals from returning home. Syria has been a hotbed of terrorism and extremism for nearly 2 decades, and it's contrary to our national interest to allow Syrians to remain in our country. TPS is meant to be temporary." Again, that temporary argument. But she's implying that Syrians here are a risk to Americans' safety. What do you make of her claims?
Well, as to the first claim, that Syria is now safe to return to, there's significant evidence that Syria remains in a state of crisis. The Department of Homeland Security's own internal analysis documents ongoing violence, humanitarian crisis, destroyed infrastructure. The U.S. State Department warns against any travel to Syria because of the significant risk of violence or death. And so, the U.S. government has recognized this and then turned around and wanted to send people to this life or death situation, based on their own political discriminatory agenda. I think as to this question about, the U.S. national interest, one of the arguments that we've put before the courts, and the lower court has agreed with us, is that the statute actually doesn't allow for termination of TPS based entirely on this sort of amorphous national interest analysis, that the statute requires a consideration of the actual conditions in the country for which TPS is designated, not whatever the secretary sees as the U.S. national interest.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Megan Hauptman. She's a litigation staff attorney for the International Refugee Assistance Project. We're discussing the Trump administration's attempt to remove TPS protections and the fight to keep them. Megan, I'm wondering for you, you're defending some of the most vulnerable people in the world, essentially. What is it like for you to be doing this work right now?
Yeah, well, I think, our plaintiffs, our clients are really incredible people. Many of them have lived in the United States for a long time. They have significant family ties here. They work as doctors, as in behavioral health and support for people with disabilities. They're business owners, homeowners. They really span the gamut. And I think getting to work with people who are facing these incredibly difficult decisions and moments is also really inspiring. And the amount of advocacy that's come out of the Syrian TPS community and other TPS communities to protect the larger community from harm is something that really motivates me to keep on doing this work.
And then at the same time, I think people across the spectrum in so many different spheres, whether you are an immigration attorney or an advocate or an immigrant yourself, there seems to be this widespread acknowledgement that our immigration system is broken. I mean, you work for an agency that is trying to protect immigrants. When people say that the immigration system is unfair, that people come here and they overstay their visas, or that they don't come here through the proper channels, what do you make of those perspectives? I mean, what do you think about those who believe either that the immigration laws are unfair, or I guess first, I want to ask if you feel that the system itself is broken.
Yeah, I think the system is broken, but perhaps from a different perspective. I think the issue is that it is often impossible or extremely difficult for people to pursue some very limited pathways to come to the United States, for instance, through the refugee resettlement program. And for people who live here already, it is extremely difficult for people to obtain more permanent forms of status. So the immigration system sort of forces people into these temporary statuses for long periods of time. And in that sense, I would agree that the system, maybe isn't functioning. I do think temporary protected status is this example of a really positive aspect of our immigration system. It demonstrates our long-term commitment to humanitarian relief, to protecting vulnerable people from danger. What we're seeing from the Trump administration is that they're trying to strip people of humanitarian protections across the board, whether it's temporary protected status, asylum, the refugee system. And, contrary to that, it's actually long been a key value and a legal commitment of the United States to provide protection to people who need it.
My last question for you in the last 20 seconds that we have here, is the U.S. doing enough when it comes to accepting refugees and protecting people who are fleeing violence and conflict and disruption?
I think at this moment, absolutely not. We see across the board, from temporary protected status to people seeking refugee resettlement, the administration is sending a clear message that the United States no longer intends to protect people who are trying to come here, who came here seeking safety, regardless of whether or not that is lawful or moral.
Megan Hauptman is a litigation staff attorney for the International Refugee Assistance Project. Megan, thank you for joining me on the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.